Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're out in the garden today. Today we're going to talk all about vertical gardening, which is one of my favorite ways to garden. So you can see in my garden, I really like to grow my plants vertically. There are a lot of reasons for that. So today what I want to talk about first is why you might want to look into vertical gardening, why I love it so much, and why I think that it is a great strategy for gardening. Next, we're going to talk about some ideas for how you may want to vertically garden, and kind of combined in with that, I think I'm going to talk about some ideas for great plants that are great candidates for growing vertically. So there are a lot of reasons why I like to grow my plants in a climbing way, vertical gardening. There's a lot of reasons why I like to grow as many of my plants as possible that way, and I think a lot of those same reasons might be reasons why you might want to consider doing that as well. Now, the first and probably most obvious, or one of the most obvious reasons that you might want to consider vertical gardening is just the fact that it saves so much space. So you can see here, I have this trellis, arch trellis here. This is completely covered with pole bean plants, and all of these plants, they're growing upright, and they just take a very small amount of actual ground space. The majority of the space that I'm using is actually walkway space, as you can see here. Now, pole beans are a plant that you don't just save space by growing them vertically. They really have to be grown vertically if you want to avoid a tangled mess. There are some plants that you have the option of growing vertically or letting them sprawl, and one of those is pumpkins, which I know I said we're going to get into specific plants a little later in this video. This is not going to be a necessarily clear-cut video where I follow the 1, 2, 3 outline perfectly, because, it's going to be a little sprawling the way my garden is. But one plant that you have the option of growing vertically or growing upright is winter squash. I'm going to show you some examples. I have some growing both ways in my garden, and I'm going to show you the differences between those two growing styles. So first of all here, take a look at this pumpkin plant. This is actually a couple plants, but honestly the majority of this is one plant that's just gone crazy. So in front of my tomatoes there on the ground, I had some empty space, and I decided, pumpkins like to sprawl. Let's grow a pumpkin there, let it sprawl. And it took me seriously. You can see it's covered the entire front of the bed. It's also come out into the walkway. It's starting to climb up my cucumber trellis here. You can see in the back, it's also climbed my tomato trellis. And then over there, it's also crossed the walkway and is starting to climb up that wall on the other side. It's also sending out another stem, which is hoping to be able to climb this green bean trellis. I don't think I'm going to allow it to do that because that's just going to be too much. But you can see this pumpkin here is really trying its best to take over the world, and it's off to a good start, at least with my garden. Let's walk over to the side yard garden expansion. I'm going to show you some sprawling winter squash that I have over there, some of which is grown vertically, and you can see a big difference. So the first thing you'll see up here is actually another pumpkin that I'm allowing to sprawl. This is a different pumpkin variety. This is a sugar pie pumpkin. But you can see I'm growing it out of the edge, basically out of the corner of this bed. And one branch is sprawling here and climbing up this chain link fence. And this other branch here is sprawling all the way along this walkway and ultimately going to climb up this trellis here. Now across the way, these are a different variety, but they're still winter squashes. And look at these, climbing the trellis. These are still spreading. You can see they're still sprawling on the ground a little bit, but by growing them vertically, I am really minimizing the amount of ground space these are taking up. And then back here, you can see yet another one climbing up. That one's a lot more under control than my sprawling pumpkin over there and the one in the other garden. Now, admittedly, large pumpkins can be a little bit of a challenge to grow vertically just because of the size of the fruits. It can be challenging for the plants to support those fruits. So the winter squashes that I've chosen to grow vertically are a smaller fruiting variety. But the principle is the same, because these winter squashes here, if I didn't have them growing up this trellis, they would be sprawling and taking up just as much space as my other pumpkins. So you can see how this trellis is saving me a lot of space with growing. These are butternut squashes over here. So you can see how it's saving me a lot of space. So there are other plants that I like to grow vertically. You can see my tomatoes in these cages behind me. Tomatoes grow a little bit differently than winter squash, but you know, the concept is still the same, where they would kind of vine all along the ground, take up a lot of space. When I can grow them supported upright instead, it's going to definitely minimize the amount of space that they take up. So growing as many plants vertically as possible is a great way to maximize space. You know, especially if you have a small garden, but honestly, even if your garden is not that small, growing your plants vertically can be a great space saver. So we're gonna head back into the main garden. We're gonna kind of be hopping back and forth for this video here. One other reason why I like to grow my plants vertically as much as possible is because it keeps the plants healthier. This is especially true of disease-prone plants like tomatoes. You know, tomatoes, if they were sprawling along the ground, they are a lot more prone to developing fungal diseases or any kind of disease really on their leaves, where if I grow them supported, I'm maximizing airflow, and that's going to help my plants stay healthier. Now, as I mentioned, that is definitely true of tomato plants, but many plants that you can grow vertically, cucumbers for example, tend to be much healthier when they're allowed to stretch upwards instead of sprawl along the ground. It really just does maximize airflow. Additionally, kind of, you know, a part two to this point here is that it makes the fruits themselves healthier. You know, if you grow your tomato plants along the ground, the fruits are also going to be along the ground, and that makes them easy prey for things like slugs and other things that like to crawl along the ground. They're going to have easy access to your tomatoes. They'll just kind of nibble on them as they go, and you could end up with, you know, bites out of your tomatoes. Your tomatoes or other fruits could also end up rotting just from the proximity to the ground and, you know, the continual moisture that's around them. So keeping the plant upright and supported is going to make the overall plant healthier, but also specifically the fruit that we want to harvest will be a lot healthier. So you can see that I'm just starting to get some beans on this trellis here. These are tiny and not quite ready to harvest yet, but lots of beans are coming. And that brings me to the next point that I want to make and why vertical gardening is so important to me. One little perk or benefit for the gardener when it comes to vertical gardening is easier harvest. Now, I showed you these little beans that are starting to develop on these plants here. If these beans were sprawling along the ground, it would be a nightmare trying to dig through all this foliage and find all the beans, especially, you know, beans for the most part are green and those blend right in with the leaves. So when I have a plant like this, when I can raise it up off the ground, it's going to make the harvest easier to find. It also makes it easier to pick. And that can be especially helpful if you're dealing with some sort of health condition, maybe back problems or knee problems or something like that. That makes it a lot harder for you to be, you know, on your knees harvesting in the garden. Being able to harvest standing up, you know, it sounds like a small thing, but when you're actually harvesting a whole bucket full of beans, being able to harvest standing up and harvest these vertically growing beans, it really does make a big difference. One other, maybe a little bit less tangible reason that I want to mention in support of vertical gardening is just the beauty of it. I mean, it's a little bit less practical than some of the other reasons, but you know, beauty in the garden, in the vegetable garden anyway, is often kind of an underrated thing, but something that I think is really important. So I love coming out to the garden in the summer when these trellises are completely covered with growing plants and even with different kinds of fruits that you can snack on. I think it just makes the garden a more beautiful place. It makes it more enjoyable to be around. And the reality of gardening is that it can be really hard work. And the more enjoyable you can make it for yourself, the more joy that you're able to get out of that garden, the more likely you are going to be to put in the time and effort that that garden really needs to stay healthy. So, well, some people might say, oh, beauty in a vegetable garden doesn't really matter. I mean, I think it's still something worth striving for. And with vertical gardening specifically, it has so many other benefits that why would we not embrace the beauty that goes with it as a wonderful bonus benefit as well? So we've talked about some of the reasons why I think vertical gardening is a great strategy in the vegetable garden. And you know, we've talked a little bit about plant varieties, and I know you've seen some of my vertical gardening structures, but I want to show you a little more specifically some of the structures or some of the, you know, the techniques that I use to grow my plants vertically, and then we'll talk a little bit about why I chose the ones I did for certain plants. Now, I really like these arched trellises here, specifically for beans and cucumbers. This is a cattle panel trellis. This is really heavy duty, and it's also fairly inexpensive as far as garden structures go. So this is something that I've really been enjoying using in my garden. It makes these beautiful tunnels. It takes up, you know, mostly walkway space. As I showed you, those beans just take up a few inches of space on either side of the tunnel. And then the rest of the space that they're taking up is walkway space, while having the byproduct of creating a beautiful trellis for us to enjoy in the garden. So I really like these for beans because, as you can see, the way these beans grow, they just wrap their stems around these metal parts of the trellis here. Pole beans are great candidates for vertical gardening. They're natural climbers, so all you have to do is provide them some sort of support to grow on, and sometimes when they're little, they might need a little bit of help and direction finding the support you have for them to climb. But once they find it, they're just going to keep wrapping their stems around it and keep going all the way up to the top. So you can see these stems keep wrapping up all the way to the top of the trellis. And it's only fairly early July, maybe mid-July at this point. These are just going to keep growing as the season goes on. So this is by far my favorite way to grow pole beans. You could also grow pole beans, you know, on poles, as the name suggests. I've done that in the past where I've gotten some bamboo stakes. I think I just got them at my local Home Depot or someplace like that. You kind of make them in a teepee, tie them. I arrange them in a circle and then tie the tops together so it makes a little bit of a teepee. And I put a few bean seeds at the base of each pole and tie them up at the top. That makes another great option for beans. The reason that I prefer these trellises is because, as I said, it takes up a lot less space in my garden, where the teepees take up more ground space. But the teepees are a great option if you don't have a trellis like this. You could also use just a freestanding vertical trellis down the middle of your garden bed. That would be another great option for pole beans. So this is a bamboo teepee trellis that I've made. I just buy these packs of bamboo, as I said, at Home Depot. Just stick them in the ground, tie them together with some twine at the top. If you just place a couple bean seeds at the base of each one, you'll have a nice bean teepee by the end of the season. Here you can see my cucumbers. I also like to grow these on the cattle panel arch similarly to the beans. You can see got some little cucumbers growing on here. And these are also natural climbers, similarly to the beans. You just give them something to grow, and then they grow by putting out these little tendrils that they wrap around, and they kind of like pull themselves up and support themselves as they go. Mine are a little bit crazy. They're kind of growing back and forth. But by the end of the season, we should have this whole arch covered with cucumber plants. Now, both beans and cucumbers also come in bush varieties. Basically, that's the equivalent of, you know, an indeterminate tomato versus a determinate tomato. I think we're all a little more familiar with that distinction versus bush beans and pole beans, or bush and pole cucumbers. I find that personally, when it comes to cucumbers, I prefer the climbing varieties. I think that they actually take up less space, definitely less space per yield, because I support them over the walkway. So they actually don't take up that much space in the garden bed itself. Now, as for pole beans, some of the other advantages that I mentioned earlier, as far as ease of harvest, I also find that pole beans produce over a longer period of time. I do grow bush beans as well, but I would say probably if I had to choose between them, pole beans would be the one that I would choose. But you know, you have that option also. Now, as we were filming this video, I actually discovered yet another benefit of vertical gardening, which I should have showed you guys. I kind of just quickly dealt with the problem without thinking. I really should have showed you. But while I was standing here, this is my rogue pumpkin, you know, that's climbing this trellis here. I just happened to look over and see a cluster of squash bug eggs on the base of the leaf there. Because this plant is growing upright, the squash bug eggs were right at my eye level and really easy to see. I wasn't even looking for them. I was just filming this video about vertical gardening. So that made them very easy for me to find and destroy before they had a chance to hatch and damage my pumpkin. One other option that we use in my garden for vertical gardening is these welded wire fences. You can see I have my tomatoes growing along this fence here. You have a lot of different options for fencing, but you can see these tomatoes here. I grow them in the center of the bed, and I clip them or tie them to the fence here as they grow. And so I've got to come out here and clip up the new growth of these tomato plants. But this allows my tomato plants to be upright down the middle of the bed, and it provides all those benefits of vertical growing that we were talking about before. Now, a fence like this comes in a big roll at, you know, we got it at Home Depot. I'm sure you could get it at any home improvement store or gardening store or Tractor Supply or any kind of, feed store or anything like that. It makes it a little bit easier to transport, a lot easier to transport than a cattle panel like we have for those arch trellises. I do definitely prefer the cattle panels, and I do actually have a video on how to get cattle panels home without a truck. We did that last summer. We picked up a bunch of cattle panels on my little SUV, and I filmed a video of it because I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with. But that being said, if you don't have a way to get cattle panels home, this welded wire fencing can be a great option because, as I said, it comes in a roll. It's definitely not as sturdy, but it is much easier to transport. Here you can see another great, easy, simple option for vertical growing, which is stakes. You can see I have my tomato plants over here. These are growing on stakes, and once again, I know I need to come clip up the new growth. But this is allowing my tomato plants to grow upright, not taking up each other's space, keeping the fruit off the ground. And it's very simple. One of the things I like about these stakes is that they are so movable. Because of the layout of this bed here, and because I'm growing all determinate tomatoes in here, which have a different growth habit than indeterminate tomatoes, like I have growing on those fences there, I find for this particular application, I prefer the stakes. Now, the way this bed is laid out, it's a square, and I have my tomato plants in a 3x3 grid. That would be pretty challenging to support on a fence. So for this layout, I find that the stakes work really well. This would work great in any other layout too. I just like the permanence, and I find that the walls overall work better for me for my indeterminate tomatoes, but for my determinates, this works great. Yet another option for tomato support is the classic tomato cage. This is not my favorite for indeterminate large fruited tomatoes, but I find that for the cherry tomatoes like I have here, this works really well. I find that indeterminate tomatoes generally get too tall for these tomato cages, and the fruits are too heavy. I find that just doesn't work that well. As you can see, my cherry tomatoes are also really too tall for the cages, but because the fruits are so much smaller, they're so much less heavy, I find that the tomato cages work well for the cherry tomatoes. I also prune my cherry tomatoes differently than my large fruited tomatoes, so because of that, I find that the tomato cages are a good option for this. Now, I know a lot of people will use the tomato cages for large slicer indeterminate tomatoes as well. As I said, that's not my preference, but if that's what you have to work with, then that is a great choice. So over there you can see another of my tomato walls. This one's a little challenging to get to right now because I have some zucchinis taking over a little bit, but you can see my wall of tomatoes here is another great option, or another great example of this type of growing. Another great, easy option for vertical gardening is to use your fencing. Now you can see the remains of my peas behind me. My peas are done for the season. It's middle of July. It's been really hot, and my peas, or peas in general, do not like hot weather, so they're very brown and crispy behind me. But this made a great support for my peas while they grew in the spring and the early summer. So you can see all these pea plants here. I planted the peas at the base of the fence, and then they climbed up the fence, and we had this whole fence lined with snap peas during the pea season. One of the reasons I really like to use the fencing in my garden for more vertical growing is that, the fence is going to be there anyway. I might as well make use of it. I might as well make the use of that space, and I might as well make the fence beautiful by covering it with growing things. We're going to head back over to the side yard garden, and I'm going to show you another example of using a fence for gardening space. Now, admittedly, these cucumbers are behind because they get eaten by slugs many times. Say hi to Fluffy. She's taking a dust bath right there. She looks a little bit bedraggled as she's rolling herself in dirt, but she's enjoying it. So these cucumbers here have been replanted many times because they kept being eaten by slugs. This year was a challenging seedling year when it came to slugs. So they've been replanted many times. That is not really the point of this video. The point of this video is you can see this chain link fence behind me. I find that that is a great place to grow cucumbers on. So every year I plant some cucumber seedlings along this fence, and I know I showed you the cucumbers in the garden. Those are going to be my main crop of cucumbers, but I like to make the most use of every space possible and get a little extra harvest by using fences like this. Incidentally, the sprawling pumpkin that I showed you before has decided to make its own vertical support and start growing up this part of the chain link fence on its own. This is a sugar pie pumpkin. You can see it's got a little pumpkin there. So this is a smaller fruited pumpkin, and this probably actually will do okay growing up along this fence here. So I'm going to let it be, and we will see what happens as the season goes on. Now here you can see one pepper plant. Most of my pepper plants are growing on my deck. I actually moved this one down here because I'm hoping to save seeds from it. So I wanted to move it away from the others and be able to prevent cross-pollination and isolate the blooms. But you can see I'm also using a stake for this pepper plant. Well, pepper plants are not always known for needing support, and honestly, I don't find that they always do. I think it depends on the variety and just on how well the plant does this year, or that specific gardening season. But I will say that plant was getting very tall. I have some other peppers on my deck that were getting very tall, and they were large fruited varieties. So I thought they would benefit from a little bit of extra support. So I've been using some of my stakes for those pepper plants just to keep them upright. And I have actually noticed a difference. On my deck, I have some pepper plants that are nice and upright and look great, and I have some that are kind of sprawling over the edge. The weight of the fruit is making them droop a little bit. And I think I should have staked all of them. So a simple stake like that is a great support for a pepper plant. So thank you so much for hanging out with me in the garden today and taking a look at all the plants I have growing vertically. If you have any other plants that you love to grow vertically, or any other techniques that you use to help them grow upright like this, I'd love to hear those in the comments below. So I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.